I decided to crowdsource this podcast. So you are all on your own and just figure it out for yourselves. Do your own thing today. Let's get to it. Welcome. Another fabulous episode of IBF On Demand. I'm your party of one and outstanding in the crowd host, Eric Wilson. You can find me at eric@ibf.org. That's eric@ibf.org. Thanks for the follows and subscribes. Follow me on LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever you get this podcast. Speaking of crowdsourcing, yes, love the shares. Love if you could help get this message out to your network then as well. So please, not only like it, but share it then as well with your network. Whatever platform you're on, please share. I want to thank Arkiva, driving business transformation by solving what others cannot. Fabulous sponsor, been around a while, so thank you, Arkiva, for being a sponsor. As I said, we're almost with our 100th episode is coming up. It's kind of a birthday for us. So make sure you stick around and celebrate that. It's going to be in a few episodes. We're going to have our 100th birthday. So make sure you come back and check out that. My actual birthday is actually coming up as well. So what'd you get me? My birthday is going to be in August 10th to be exact, if you're wondering when my birthday is. And I'm actually going to be spending it in Nashville. But good thing, you can spend it with me. We're going to be at a conference in Nashville. It's a supply and demand conference. It's a huge conference. It's actually a boot camp. Sorry, not a conference, boot camp. But me and another individual named Todd's going to be coming down, running that boot camp in Nashville that week in August. So the week of August 7th, 8th, 9th type of situation. We're going to be doing a boot camp. So come down, celebrate my birthday with me, but also check out that as well. Groupthink is the practice of thinking or making decisions as a group in a way that discourages creativity and individual responsibility. That's obviously a bad thing. I wonder if we can rethink that definition and turn it into a good thing. The practice of thinking or making a decision as a group in a way that encourages creativity and individual personas. In other words, we're talking about crowdsourcing. And that's a little bit what we're going to talk about today. Forecasting, one of the 5 undeniable truths in forecasting is that the more relevant inputs I have into the process, the better the results are going to be, the better the forecast is going to be. It's obvious, but that's why it's one of the laws of forecasting. In some ways, it actually correlates to the law of large numbers. I mean, it's the jelly bean analogy. If I had a jar of jelly beans and I asked one person to pick, and hey, Michael, how many jelly beans? And you're way off. You're a horrible guesser. But Sue and Samantha and all the other people, when you guess everybody together, you diverge towards a mean that's actually pretty close to how many jelly beans are in there. It's the law of large numbers. It's using crowdsourcing to try to diverge to what the answer is going to be. So we see the advantages of crowdsourcing forecasting to a certain extent, and we see the advantages of more relevant inputs into our process. We understand the benefits of multiple people and personas adding relevant insights. We understand on that. The key thing is finding what are the relevant inputs, finding the people, and taking the bias out of the process. And believe me, it can be done. That's the reason why I'm bringing on the next guest. Matthew actually has a PhD in political science and taught and built election forecasting models. He worked as a data scientist and now is the head of predictive intelligence team at General Mills and leads their enterprise forecasting capabilities. He's also, though, the founder and CEO of the Geni Project, a behavioral insights company that uses generative AI to uncover consumer insights and traditional methods cannot. You've been wanting for a while for me to find real-life examples of generative AI and how it's being utilized. Guess what? I found one and found an expert guest that can talk about it. Please help me welcome Matthew. So welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
I think we ran into each other a couple times. You were in, I think, was it Seattle or Chicago you were at?
Chicago. Yep.
And then we ran into each other again in Chicago at the Prevadaire conference there as well. So we've crossed paths a few times, and I've been wanting to get you on the podcast, and I'm glad you had the opportunity to share with our guests and things that I've talked with you about.
Yeah, I very much appreciate it. Happy to talk a little bit more. And yeah, maybe we'll run into each other in Chicago again, or perhaps elsewhere in the future.
I'm sure our paths are going to cross again. Now, you actually have a couple of things you're doing. Let's start off. I mean, you're at General Mills there, and you started off as data science. So, I mean, what's some of the things that you're doing with General Mills right now?
Yeah. So I started off as a lead data scientist after my PhD program. Did a bunch of consumer analytic type things, and then I transitioned quickly to lead our enterprise-wide forecasting capability. So it's a lot of like high level forecasts. So if you think of something like cereal as a food category, we'll forecast out that category in the future. And because it's General Mills, we play in a lot of categories across the globe. So we do all the category level forecasts for any category that we have a product in. And we provide those then for corporate strategy initiatives, right? It helps us understand like our portfolio shaping, if we need to do mergers and acquisitions, like the idea of growth exposure. How do we look overall? Are we performing up to expectations? Things like that. We track those things across time, but it's a lot of strategy type work at that level.
Wow. So, I mean, if you're looking at these are strat forecasts, so they go beyond the 3-month time horizon, I'm assuming then, correct? Is that a safe assumption?
Yeah. They go, so we do 36-month out forecasts. So you need a lot of historic data to do that. We probably, if I'm being honest, we probably shouldn't be doing 36 months out because who knows what's going to happen that far into the future, but we do from that perspective. Yeah.
Well, that was going to be my next quick question is I always preach, time series, it starts to degrade very quickly after a few months, especially anything that's kind of linear and extrapolation. So, I mean, time series doesn't do well. It always starts breaking down when you get into 36-month time horizon. So, I mean, are you're data science? I'm assuming you're accessing machine learning, some other types of ways of being able to build out those strat forecasts. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And we've got a pretty large pipeline built out where we do a grid search through a bunch of different models and things like that to identify what's the best from an error or accuracy standpoint. What are the best models we can choose from to use, and then we'll combine a few of those to actually produce a forecast. But you're absolutely right. Like 36 months out, especially with something, if you get any type of exponential trend or anything like that, it's going to be very, very damaging. So we apply a bunch of methodologies where we'll actually warp the time or the predictions that are that far into the future, and we'll like bend them back to historic averages and things like that. Because usually the best bet for a lot of these things is if you don't have a good idea in a year and a half as to where your category is going to be, it's like just go with the historic average. So that's the approach we take.
So you have something called consumers then with General Mills. I'm assuming then do those people kind of play into it as far as trying to understand the consumers and the trends you're seeing there besides just a cereal. I'm assuming if you're doing a 36 months, you have to understand the people buying the cereal as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we have an approach where we take our statistical models that we produce, and then we meet with all sorts of individuals across the business. And what they'll do is they understand if there's anything going on within the cereal category. Do we have investment there? Are we doing anything in terms of price and things like that? So they'll bring their input as to where they think the statistical model's going. Do they think it's off? Do they think it's under predicting or things of that nature? And then we also take into consideration just the economic overall landscape. So we have a bunch of individuals in the company who do work to try to understand how consumers will respond based on the economy. And so it's kind of those three things coming together where we'll produce these forecasts, have conversations about them, and kind of set things and tweak things as to where we think they'll land. And then we update that in a quarterly cadence. So it is truly that kind of cooperative, right, collaborative approach where it's not just a statistical model. It's not just business or practitioner forecasts. We try to kind of mesh the two worlds together.
So you got the time series, you got the econometric, you got the consumer, facing type of modeling. You're kind of meshing those together to say, hey, long term, this is what we anticipate this brand doing, this kind of industry to do.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and it's one of those things where because you need a lot of buy-in, especially at that level, right? The corporate strategy level. You need people are using these things for all sorts of purposes, whether it's setting our growth exposure or like targets for certain of the businesses. Yeah, and so we need a lot of buy-in. We need a lot of understanding across the orgs. We try to bring as much opinions in as possible to have those conversations to try to get at the best numbers ultimately.
Well, and that was the other thing. I know we've talked a few times. So it was interesting some of the other things you're doing with that then as well, because you're also working with the Jenny project. So was that the impetus for this, or more direct question, how did that idea originate then?
Yeah, yeah. So the Jenny project, it goes back about a year now, and it's just kind of a few fortuitous events happened simultaneously. So one is I was reading a paper by it was by some economists from the Fed, right, Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. They put out a study that compares. It looks at large language models and their ability to forecast. So just something like ChatGPT, right? You could provide a prompt to ChatGPT to ask it to forecast something, and they were focused on inflation forecasts. I think the model that they were using was Google's Palm, if I'm not mistaken, but it's a little while back, so I could be wrong. I would check that to verify. And then they were just asking it to forecast inflation in the future, and then they would compare those forecasts with the survey of professional forecasters to see how they, which was doing better. And they actually found that the large language models produce a relatively decent, stable forecast. And I was, didn't think too much of it at the time, but I was like, oh, this is interesting, unique. And then also, I was reading, I'm not sure if you read it before, but it's a book called Super Forecasting by Philip Tetlock.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great book,
Absolutely.
right? I think I was
Great
actually,
book.
yeah, rereading it at this point. And what Tetlock does is he identifies a bunch of individuals who are really good at forecasting and then figures out why they're good at forecasting. So, like, that was in my head at the same time. And I'm also very familiar with the wisdom of the crowds forecasting approach, right? Nate
Yep.
Silver talks about how
Nate.
it's actually a very accurate way to do it, but it's very, very difficult to implement because there's a couple of assumptions you have to do to make to do it appropriately. And then, so all that, again, all this is stewing in my head at the same time. And I was getting asked these questions like, like all my friends, family, people at work, they know I in predictive analytics, they know I do forecasting. So I had these questions like, how many marriages would there be in 2024? And I was like, I don't know. I could look up the data to try to figure it out, but I had no idea. And then there were these things going on across General Mills where they were looking at like regions where we don't currently operate, but like to sell food in certain regions. And there's no data as to how performance would be. It's new products to some degree. It's regions that they just don't collect a lot of data on. And so these three things kind of came together for me, where it was, I could use these large language, like the paper, right, the Fred paper. I could use these large language models, not just ask them to forecast something, but I could create like expert forecasting personas, right? So I could give them the traits that I identified in Tetlock's book or traits like that, right? And provide that to them. Because we do know, and there's a lot of research on this, if you prompt a large language model with something like to be confident or to be anxious, it'll change its behavior and respond differently based on those things. And then second thing was that just this idea of the wisdom of the crowds approach, right? You don't need just one of these large language models to do this. You could do, 12 or 100 or 1,000 and then combine the responses and take the average to try to get, an accurate forecast for something. And then you didn't need data for it, which was super cool, right? So you could do things like new products. You could do all sorts of types of forecasts if you wanted to do them quick and within a matter of seconds. And so I started like going down this rabbit hole. Again, this was just something I was doing in my own time, and I started testing some of this out with actual data. So I was feeding these large language models like publicly available data. So I wouldn't tell them what it was, right? I'd just give them a data set and see, like, ask them to predict it out in the future. And then I would compare that with some of the common Python forecasting packages and see which was doing better. And the large language models, this wisdom of the crowds approach with the large language models, actually produce slightly more accurate forecasts than some of the Python packages. So I was like, oh, that's fascinating. And so then what I did was I removed didn't give them any data, and I just asked them to forecast the individual item without any context or anything like that. So it's like, if it's inflation or something along those lines. And so they would forecast it out. And again, they were pretty accurate. And so I was like shocked that you didn't need. So I'm a data person, right? I always been, right? Data scientist. Back to election forecasting, all that's through data. And I was like surprised that you didn't need data to forecast some of these things. And what was cool too is you could get them to like give you all of the context behind the reasons they forecasted. So you could ask them for, these large language models, what is your forecast and what are your reasons behind it? If you got 1,000 of them, then you just ask for a large language model on top of those to summarize ultimately what the forecasting reasons are. So you can get a summary as to the context behind things. And that's always been like a big struggle with General Mills, is when we produce statistical models and machine learning models, everybody always asks what's driving this. And it's hard to give that explanation, but with this, it's really nice because it provides all that context for you. And then you can also apply things like endless customization with this because it's just prompts that you're producing. So I can, if you got time, I'll give you a quick example.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
I'd love, give me an example. I was my next question is, can you provide an example of exactly how does this technology work? Because you say we don't have data, and I'm like, wait a minute, you have to have data. Data is forecasting. So I'd love to hear an example of exactly how this is working then.
Yeah. So basically, after I built out the technology, like I went and I looked up some obscure fashion brands to see if I could just forecast them. And one thing that came up, and I'm probably butchering the name. It's Anakiki is a fashion brand in China. And I apologize if I'm butchering the name. I probably am. I was like, let's try this, right? There's no data actually on Anakiki as a brand. And so I said, can we forecast Anakiki shoe sales in the future? So Anakiki, it's a modern like fashion company in China. Reminds me a lot of like the pop art era. So, like Andy Warhol and that type of thing. And so what I did, I used it to create or asked it just if it could forecast these things using the same approach that I just laid out. And it created just a baseline forecast that I could provide. But I also then would prompt it with things like, well, okay, you've got a base understanding. What if we say that there's going to be a recession in China in 2025? Like, how would that change your forecast? And then they would spit out a different forecast. So I was just going through and creating like these different scenarios based on how the economy would play out with these forecasts, which was fascinating. But how does it work? Which I think is your question. So ultimately, I would consider, this might sound overly confident, but I would consider myself an expert in forecasting at this point. And so if I were asked something like, predict Anakiki shoe sales into the future, what would I do about that, or how would I start it? And at first I would look up what is Anakiki, right? I have no idea what it is. Let's look it up. Is there any type of performance data on it? Are there other companies similar to it that have performance data? Who would buy these shoes? What types of consumers are buying these things? How do they hold up based on the Chinese economy? Like that, I would just go through this research lens, right, to try to identify these things. Then I would take all of this in and eventually make a prediction based on whether it was through some statistical model or just, an estimate like in Tetlock's book, Super Forecasting, right? Using some of those traits where you can make somewhat accurate estimates. And then, we would ask 99 others like me from different parts of, the country and different backgrounds, but all experts at the same time to do the same thing and to produce. Then once we all have 100 forecasts, we would take the average and use that as our forecast. It's very, very similar to what's going on with these large language models. So we implement something. I mean, they're trained on the web, right? So they have an understanding as to how humans behave. Then we assign them those super forecasting traits. And then we also implement things like function calling and retrieval augmented generation, so they can actually have access to the most updated data. So if they need to know how the Chinese economy is performing, right, to make their forecast, they'll have access. They'll have that access at their fingertips. So it's a lot of making sure we have things right in terms of what we're asking these large language models, but then they're behaving in that way where they can actually go out and do the research, except they can do it in like a matter of fractions of a second because they are large language models and not humans.
Okay, so in my simple mind, what I'm hearing then is you're still starting with the end in mind. You're starting with the why, or you're starting with the here's what I want to solve. That's the basis of how it begins then, correct? You're pretty much reverse engineering. I want this. What are the pieces? Who do I know? What else do I know? But you're starting with the end in mind and reverse engineering it from there is your starting point. Is that safe to say?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. Because if you're not starting with that objective and goal in mind, you're going to be lost in the process. So I think you're right there.
Okay, so then the next thing I heard was you're actually utilizing large language models, generative AI, to help then fill in the blanks. You have the end, you have some details, but you're using generative AI, large language models to really help fill in those blanks is what you're doing then. Is that the next correct assumption?
Yeah. So it's more. I mean, I view things like generative AI and large language models as a tool to achieve something, right? That's So I'm just using them in that way where we do have that end goal, like you said, that objective in mind, and we can use them, utilize what they're good at, things that they're good at, to hopefully get you closer to that outcome, depending on whether it's accurate or not. But yeah.
Okay, so with that, Gen AI is a buzzword. You're hearing it all now. You got Chat GPT. Even my grandmother can repeat, generative AI. She doesn't know what it means, but she knows the word now. So, can you help explain to the audience? I mean, because we don't see a lot of use cases really working yet in, especially demand planning. Can you go kind of break it down and say, yeah, this is a use case, but this is how we're seeing it being starting to utilize now in planning now?
Yeah. So in demand planning, it's a little bit tricky, right? Because you go so granular and so fine level. So I tend to think of these things more as a kind of a corporate strategy level type thing. You could potentially apply it to that granular, but it's tough because it's not a lot of the forecasting that's done for demand planning tends to be something that can be scaled very, very quickly because typically you're forecasting hundreds or thousands of SKUs or units or whatever you're ultimately forecasting, right? Some of this stuff, it takes a little bit more because you have to, basically iterate through a bunch of these different personas. Even if you ask a single one, right, you have to customize it to each individual single large language model. So it's a little bit trickier at that level. But if you take the approach where you want to make sure everything aligns in unison from all the way below to your SKU up to your category or something like that, at the category level and the corporate strategy level, I think this is where this ultimately comes into play because we see, I mean, when we think about we think about how corporate strategy views the world. They tend to think of things in terms of scenarios. So I know if you're at the C-suite level, right, they're always looking for guidance and scenarios based on the macroeconomic climate. At least that's what I'm familiar with, right? And so ultimately, like, you can use something like this at that level because it does provide that context and that very easy ability to create any type of scenario based off of it. And then you can use that again ultimately through this entire process, right? If these things are integrated to some degree to inform some lower level forecasts, especially at the demand level. But yeah, in terms of like actually applying some of this that low, a little bit tricky right now. I don't really see it as kind of a demand planning option, but more of that kind of C-suite corporate strategy level.
Now, I know some places where you could see utilization, and I think you even mentioned this when we talked before. You could actually then, this same logic, the same concept, Jenny project, could be utilized then for new product introductions or market research that typically took weeks to do and individuals research to get back. You're looking to be able, this could actually help facilitate that. You still have the why. You can still utilize this type of generative AI and language models to be able to fill in the gaps for that as within, I'm assuming, as well.
Yeah, and that's really the objective and goal of the Jenny project, right? We're a behavioral insights company, and I've got the background in political science and consumer market insights, so I like behavior. I'm always interested in behavior, and so we use our technology more or less to find new insights that you perhaps couldn't capture, whether it's as quickly or it's even things that you couldn't capture at all, using these what are called AI panelists, right? So you create 1,000 of these individuals to ask them like survey questions, experiments, and things like that. The interesting thing about it, although, is these AI panelists, they don't have like the same types of biases as humans, right? So if you think of a survey and you ask a survey question, you have to be very, very careful on framing and how you position questions and things like that, because based on those things, it can change the answer of how a human would respond to it. We don't have those same issues with these AI panelists because we can ultimately wipe their memories, which comes very much in handy. And I give you an example of some of the things that we've done that can kind of showcase this, right? So there's this idea of we're working to kind of identify optimal price points and things like that. And we can take any type of consumer product. So if you think of something like Fruit Loops, and if Fruit Loops wanted to know what its optimal price point would be compared to something like the Walmart private label version, which is called Fruit Spins, right? So it's a kind of the knockoff Walmart version. Then you got Fruit Loops, which is the Kellogg product. And we could construct a scenario where we create just an AI persona, and then we can drop them in a virtual Walmart store and ask them, you've got these two products here. You're looking and thinking about buying. You got the Fruit Loops and the Fruit Spins. Fruit Loops is $3 a box. Fruit Spins is $2 a box. Which one do you buy? Ask the persona that, and they could say, Fruit Loops. And we say, okay, cool. We'll ask them why, record why, and then we'll wipe the memory, do the same exact scenario again, but increase the price of Fruit Loops by 16 cents. So it's now $3.16 for Fruit Loops and $2 for Fruit Spins. See, ask them the same question, which do you buy? And then you keep doing that until you get to a point where they go to Fruit Spins. And so the optimal price gap as to where you're going to lose that consumer if you go too far. And then the fact that you do it not just with one person, but you do it with 1,000 of these AI personas, each having different demographic backgrounds and things like that. You can identify price cliffs, you can identify all sorts of unique things, and you can do it from a consumer lens, right? Which is very, very rare. But you can't get a lot of those insights, especially in terms of pricing, from that consumer perspective. So things like that, right, are ultimately what we're interested in with this technology.
So the way I looked at it, I said it's Delphi model on steroids. Where before you'd go out and interview a dozen people and diverge towards a mean or a consensus response. This is doing it with AI personas. You don't have people. You're creating personas and allowing them to drive in essence, a Delphi method on steroids is what you're doing then. I mean,
yeah.
So real quick, I mean, that's going to confuse people. It confuses me sometimes. So how do you get an answer from something that's a persona? Or how do you create a persona that provides the same answer as if you were to talk to 1,000 people?
Yeah. So and just to be clear, we are creating, so if we talk to 1,000 people, right, we would actually talk to 1,000 personas, right? So it'd be a match in terms of numbers. They would just have like different backgrounds and things like that. So we have a whole like list of ways that we construct different demographics, psychographics, backstories, and things like that. And we combine them all into a single persona, right? So I could create something like if I wanted to know, your race, your age, your gender, where do you live, your job, your income, all sorts of things like that. So we'll create and just combine these characteristics into a single individual. And then we'll convince the large language models to assume those character profiles. And so you can think of that character profile like this person. Let's call this person Michael Garza, right? Doesn't exist, right? We give him a name. He doesn't actually exist in the real world. But what's important is that he looks like somebody who does exist in the real world. And then you can have 1,000 of these, again, who have different backgrounds because we can just construct them slightly differently. And then you can ask them these types of questions. And the cool thing about all this is, and the most interesting thing about all this is, actually, I'll ask you a question. Have you heard of? So I'm a game theorist by training. Have you heard of the ultimatum game before?
No, I haven't heard of that one.
Okay, this is a very cool game. So basically what would happen is you and I would be in a negotiation where I was given $10 and I had to give you some of that in order for us to walk away.
I do know what you're talking about. I do know what you're talking about. Yes.
So if I were to
go ahead and explain it. Yes.
Yeah. So if I were to offer you $1, and I would keep 9, right? You would likely say no. That's not a fair offer, right? I know that you get to keep 9. You're only giving me 1. That's not fair. I'm not going to do that. So we would both walk away empty-handed. But if I said, you know what, Eric, I'll give you $4. I'll walk away with 6. It's not exactly fair, but it's a pretty decent offer. You're more likely to be like, yeah, I'll accept the $4. So that way you get 4, I get 6, and we're both happy to some degree. If you were to ask a computer this from a strictly rational choice perspective, they would accept a penny, right? Because it's greater than 0. So that's all you'd have to offer a computer would be a penny, and you'd always get to walk away with the rest. But the interesting thing is these large language models behave very, very similarly to humans, right? They won't accept you. They increase the likelihood of acceptance similarly to how actual humans will increase their likelihood. So it's like around $3.50, $4, where I think it's about $3, where it's about 50% probability they'll accept it or they'll deny it, right? So which is very, very similar to humans. So like whether they don't know it probably, but they behave as if they have this concept of fairness, which is not a rational concept in this sense, right? So it's very fascinating that they're behaving in this way.
That's fascinating. I mean, that's what I wanted to talk about because it is fascinating. It's a true use case, and I can definitely see how it can be integrated. So with that, this is actually once you start understanding personas and creating the personas and being able to understand then price optimization, utilizing these type of models, doing more of the macros that they can then another system or person can then drill down into the details. This can work with current systems and current processes people have in place. That's a safe assumption, correct, isn't it?
Yeah. I think, and we're going with that approach too. So it can do a couple things, right? It can enhance some of the things that you do because there's all sorts of like pricing strategies and things like that that exist. The unique thing is we can provide new edges and new ways to look at things that you perhaps couldn't provide before. But yeah, it's all the intention is more or less. So again, being a behavioral insights company, we just want to get better at understanding human behavior, and there's always new advances in technology that do that across time, right? We're one of those where we're trying to help provide that advantage because especially like consumer insights and market research and those types of companies that are so reliant on these things, like in the CPG realm for General Mills, they're always looking for those advanced technologies to give them that competitive edge. And just the fact that behavior is so fascinating, and then having like this technology at your fingertips, like it allows us to kind of help in that arena.
It's fascinating, and I'm glad we had the opportunity to come on and be able to talk about it with the audience, because I'm sure we could talk a lot bit more, and who knows, you get a couple more case studies, bring you back on, we'll talk more in depth about it, because I'm sure it's gonna create more questions for the audience than it will answers, but at least it's gonna get them thinking, because it's gotten me thinking ever since I've talked to you. So I'm glad you came on board, because I think it's something people need to start looking into, and it's a definite niche that you fulfill.
Yeah. Again, thanks for having me, and I'm happy to talk about this in any level of detail that you're interested in. Feel free, if anybody's interested, they want to reach out on LinkedIn. I love having these conversations, right, to talk about these types of things. So always happy to do that.
Yeah, you're nerdy like me. Admit it.
True, that's
All
true.
right. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure I'll see you at a future conference.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Eric.
All righty. Bye. That was an amazing interview. I wish we could have went longer. Time only permits so long, because you only guys listen so long anyway. So I can't keep going too long, or you're going to tune out. But that was some amazing stuff. I'll probably have him on in the future. We can talk a little bit more in depth about the technical side of things, because I'm sure people are going to be wanting more information on that as well. And we're seeing a lot more companies start to try to understand the consumer and the behaviors of the consumers better. And that's what that Ginny project does. Well, that's a wrap. I'm going to go work with the Ginny project to figure out what the sell of my new book should be. And I bet it should be something below $70. My name is Eric. You can find me at eric@ibf.org. That's eric@ibf.org. I want to thank Arkiva for driving business transformation by solving what others cannot. Another great product that does a lot of be able to enable what you're doing as well. Something like, getting those insights is one thing. You have to be able to do something with them. Arkiva helps solve that problem for you. There is a new book coming out, Practical Guide for Sales and Operations Planning, S&op and IBP. Besides that, I do have another book. If you aren't familiar, a couple years ago, I wrote another book called Predictive Analytics for Business Forecasting. It really talks about demand planning 2.0. I don't quite get as far as what Matthew talked about and Matt talked about today, but I really push you to really looking at external data, getting closer to consumer demand, and rethinking the traditional demand planning we've done in the past. And it gives you introduction at a very high level so that you can start understanding it, communicating, and go deeper dive into things like neural networks and decision trees and things of that sort as well. So check it out as well, Predictive Analytics for Business Forecasting. It's another book I wrote a couple years ago. It's available as well. All of those are available at ibf.org, where there's a lot of other great content and information available as well, including future conferences. Going to be in Nashville in August, so check that out as well. And remember, the one thing you can't outsource or crowdsource. I wouldn't want to crowdsource this. Don't forget, wash your hands.